Hello, dear listeners. Welcome back to another gripping tale from Shadow Storyteller. If you enjoy real-life mysteries that tug at your heart and stir your soul, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Your support helps bring more stories like this to life. Now settle in, take a deep breath, and let the night carry you into a story of survival, hope, and the unyielding will to return home. Missing hiker found alive. It was the last week of October in the year 2023, when the crisp mountain air of the Cascade Range began to bite with the promise of early snow. The forests of Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest in Washington state were cloaked in gold and crimson, their leaves whispering secrets to the wind as autumn tightened its grip. It was here, deep within a labyrinth of old-growth cedar and fir, that 32-year-old Theron Vale vanished without a trace. Theron was not your typical weekend hiker. A quiet cartographer by trade, he spent his days mapping forgotten trails and his nights poring over topographic charts by lamplight. He preferred solitude over crowds, silence over chatter, and the rhythm of his own footsteps over the hum of city life. On that fateful Tuesday morning, he set out alone on a route he'd meticulously planned, a loop through the Thunder Creek Basin, a remote stretch rarely visited even by seasoned backpackers. He told no one but his landlord, a retired park ranger named Dale, that he was going. Back by Friday, he'd said with a calm nod and a half smile. Weather's holding. But the weather didn't hold. By Thursday night, a sudden cold front rolled in from the Pacific, dumping nearly 8 inches of wet snow across the high elevations. Temperatures plummeted below freezing. Winds howled through the valleys like wolves on the hunt. By Saturday morning, when Theron failed to return his rented cabin key and missed his weekly call to his sister in Portland, Dale grew uneasy. He drove to the trailhead himself, found Theron's battered Subaru parked exactly where he'd left it, but no sign of the man. Search and rescue teams were mobilized within hours. Helicopters scanned the ridgelines. K9 units combed the underbrush. Volunteers with snowshoes and thermal blankets fanned out across the basin, calling Theron's name into the white void. Days turned into a week. Hope began to fray at the edges. Then, on the morning of November 5th, 11 days after he'd disappeared, a faint radio signal crackled through the static on an emergency frequency. It came from a handheld beacon, weak but unmistakable, buried beneath a snowdrift near a collapsed lean-to beside Silver Creek. Rangers rushed to the coordinates. What they found defied belief. There, curled beneath a tarp salvaged from his shredded backpack, wrapped in layers of emergency foil and damp wool, was Theron Vale, alive. Barely. His lips were cracked, his cheeks hollowed by hunger, his fingers blackened at the tips from frost nip. But his eyes, those sharp, quiet eyes, were open, alert. He whispered a single word, water. The story of how he survived would unfold slowly, like a map unrolled in the dim light of recovery. After slipping on an icy boulder near Cascade Pass, he'd fractured his left ankle and tumbled nearly 30 feet into a ravine. His phone died within hours. His GPS unit shattered on impact. With no way to signal for help, he rationed his remaining food, a half-eaten protein bar, 2 packets of instant oatmeal, and melted snow in his metal canteen using a small fire he kept alive with trembling hands. When the snowstorm hit, he burrowed into a natural rock overhang, reinforcing it with fallen branches and pine boughs. He kept moving his fingers and toes every hour, reciting old trail names like mantras to stay awake. Cedar Flats, Boulder Creek, Ironwood Ridge, he'd murmur into the dark as if naming them could summon their protection. 4 days he heard helicopters pass overhead, but the thick canopy and swirling snow masked his location. On the 9th night, delirious with cold and dehydration, he activated his emergency beacon, though he doubted anyone would hear it. He'd already begun to say goodbye to the world in his mind, imagining his sister's face, the smell of rain on Portland streets, the weight of a warm blanket. Yet somehow, impossibly, the signal pierced through. Rescuers later said it was a miracle he was found when he was. Another day and hypothermia might have claimed him. Another night without fire and the cold would have won. But Theron held on, not with grand gestures but with stubborn, quiet persistence. the kind that doesn't make headlines but saves lives. In the weeks that followed, as he recovered in a Seattle hospital, reporters asked him what kept him going. He paused for a long time, staring out the window at the distant silhouette of the Cascades. Then he said softly, "I just kept thinking someone would come looking. And I owed it to them to still be here when they did." Today Theron walks with a slight limp, but he still hikes, though never alone. He carries 2 beacons now, extra batteries, and a note in his pack that reads, "Tell someone where you're going." He visits schools and outdoor clubs, sharing his story not as a warning, but as a testament, that even in the deepest silence, hope can echo. And sometimes, on clear autumn evenings, if you listen closely near Thunder Creek, you might hear the wind carry a whisper, not of fear but of gratitude. For warmth. For rescue. For the fragile, fierce thread that ties us to each other, even when we walk alone. In the months following his rescue, Theron Vale became something of a quiet legend in the Pacific Northwest hiking community, not because he sought attention but because his story refused to fade. Local rangers began citing his experience during safety briefings. Outdoor gear shops displayed his tattered map beside emergency kits, not as a trophy but as a reminder. Preparation meets fate in the wilderness, and sometimes only resilience decides the outcome. Theron returned to his small apartment in Bellingham with a new rhythm to his days. Mornings began not with coffee and charts, but with physical therapy exercises by the window, where he could watch the mist rise off Lake Whatcom. His left ankle still ached when rain threatened, a ghost of the fall that nearly ended him. Yet he never resented the mountains. Instead, he studied them more closely, as if they had spoken to him in that ravine and he was still deciphering their language. He began volunteering with the same search and rescue unit that had found him. Not in the field, at least not yet, but behind the scenes, helping to refine grid search patterns and improve beacon signal protocols. His cartography skills proved invaluable. He redrew several backcountry maps used by volunteers, marking microterrain features that could hide a person from aerial view: rock overhangs, dense thickets, dry creek beds masked by snow. Visibility isn't just about line of sight, he told a training group one evening. It's about understanding where the land wants to hide you. His sister, Leora, flew up from Portland more often now. She'd never been outdoorsy, but after his disappearance, she bought a pair of hiking boots and a first aid manual. On her 3rd visit, she asked him to take her on a short trail, just 2 miles, flat and well marked. He agreed, though his hands trembled slightly as he checked her pack. They walked slowly, pausing often, not because of his ankle, but because she kept stopping to photograph moss on tree trunks or the way sunlight filtered through alder leaves. "You see everything," she said, watching him scan the horizon not with fear but with reverence. "Even now." "I have to," he replied. "The land doesn't forget. And neither should we." Word of his recovery reached national news outlets, but Theron declined most interviews. He made one exception for a public radio segment on wilderness safety, where he spoke not about his ordeal, but about the volunteers who braved snow and exhaustion to find him. "They didn't know me," he said, voice steady but soft. "But they came anyway. That's the part worth remembering." Meanwhile, the lean-to near Silver Creek, what remained of it, was quietly preserved by park officials. Not as a monument but as a teaching point. Rangers now use it during winter training. This is where Theron lasted 11 days. This is how he insulated his shelter. This is why you never assume a signal is too weak to send. Back in Bellingham, Theron started a small project he called the Echo List. It began as a notebook where he wrote down the names of missing persons reported in national parks across the country, along with their last known coordinates, gear they carried, and weather conditions at the time of disappearance. Over time, it grew into a shared digital log accessible to volunteer groups, updated in real time. He never claimed it was revolutionary. "It's just," he explained to a fellow volunteer, "so we don't forget that every dot on a map was once someone breathing, hoping, waiting." Winter returned to the Cascades that year with a gentler hand. Snow fell in soft layers, blanketing the peaks without fury. Theron watched it from his window, a wool blanket over his lap, a mug of ginger tea steaming beside him. He no longer dreamed of falling. Instead, his dreams were filled with quiet trails, the sound of a distant stream, and the steady crunch of boots on packed earth. His own or someone else's, it didn't matter. What mattered was that the path continued. One afternoon in late January he received a letter. It was handwritten on thick, cream-colored paper, postmarked from Montana. The sender introduced herself as Mara Ellery, a Forest Service officer who had led part of the ground search during those desperate days in November. She wrote that his survival had changed how her team approached winter operations. Slower sweeps, more listening, less assumption. "We used to look for bodies," she wrote. "Now we look for signs of life, however faint." She ended with a simple request. "If you ever come through Glacier Country, I'd be honored to hike a trail with you. No rush. No agenda. Just two people walking, grateful to be above ground." Theron read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in the top drawer of his desk, beside his sister's first hiking permit and a smooth river stone he'd pocketed the day he left the hospital. Spring arrived earlier than expected. By March, the lower trails were clear and wildflowers pushed through the damp soil like promises kept. Theron returned to the Thunder Creek Basin, not alone, but with a small group of search and rescue trainees. He didn't speak much on the hike. He pointed out where the snow had drifted deepest, where the wind funneled through the canyon, where a signal might bounce or fade. At the site of his shelter, now marked with a discreet wooden stake, he knelt and placed a single pine cone on the earth. No words, just acknowledgement. Later, sitting by the creek with the trainees, one young woman asked, "Were you scared the whole time?" Theron looked at the water rushing over smooth stones, clear and cold. "Not the whole time," he said. "Fear came in waves. But between them, there was stillness. And in that stillness I remembered who I was. Not just a man lost in the woods, but someone who belonged to people. That made all the difference." As the sun dipped behind the western ridge, casting long shadows across the valley, the group packed up and began the hike back. Theron lingered for a moment, listening. The wind moved through the trees like a breath. Somewhere upstream a bird called. And for the first time since his rescue he felt not like a survivor but like a part of the landscape again. Wounded, yes, but healing. Rooted. Back home he updated the echo list. 2 new names. 2 new coordinates. He added notes on recent weather patterns, possible shelter sites, water sources. Then he closed the file, turned off his lamp, and stepped outside. The night was clear. Stars pricked the velvet sky, countless and calm. He stood there for a long time, breathing in the cool air, feeling the earth beneath his boots, solid, enduring, alive. And somewhere, far beyond the ridgelines, another hiker checked their map, told someone their route, and stepped onto the trail, carrying, unknowingly, a little piece of Theron's hope with them. Months passed, and the rhythm of Theron's life settled into something quieter, yet richer, like a river that had carved a deeper channel through stone. He no longer flinched at the sound of wind rattling his window pane, nor did he avoid maps with rugged terrain. Instead, he leaned into the lessons the wilderness had etched into him, not as scars but as compass points. By early summer of 2024, Theron had begun collaborating with a non-profit dedicated to improving emergency response in remote areas. The organization, called Horizon Reach, specialized in equipping backcountry rangers with low-cost satellite beacons and training them in psychological first aid, because, as Theron often said, finding someone is only half the rescue. The other half is helping them feel safe again. He traveled occasionally, not far, never alone, but enough to share his insights. In Boise, he spoke to a group of college students studying environmental science. In Missoula, he worked with a team testing a new thermal drone capable of detecting body heat through dense canopy. Each trip was measured, deliberate. He carried a small notebook in his breast pocket, not for maps this time, but for names. Names of people he met who had their own stories of getting lost, literally or otherwise, and finding their way back. One evening in late June, while giving a talk at a community center in Leavenworth, a Bavarian-style village nestled in the eastern foothills of the Cascades, he noticed an older man sitting in the back row, arms crossed, eyes fixed on him with an intensity that felt familiar. After the talk, the man approached slowly, leaning on a carved hickory cane. "You're the one they found near Silver Creek," the man said, not as a question, but as a quiet confirmation. Theron nodded. Yes, sir. The man extended a weathered hand. Name's Harlan Briggs. I was part of the K-9 unit that searched Sector 4. My dog Juno, she's the one who caught your scent near the creek bend on day 9. Theron's breath caught. He'd heard about Juno, the German shepherd who'd refused to leave a patch of snow-dusted ferns, barking until her handler dug through the underbrush and found Theron's dropped glove. That glove, soaked and frozen, had been the first real clue that he was still alive. I owe you and her my life, Theron said, his voice thick. Harlan shook his head. Nah, you owed yourself that. We just followed the trail you left behind. Even when you thought you'd left nothing. He paused, then added, Juno passed last winter. Peaceful in her sleep. But she'd be glad to know you're walking. They sat on a bench outside the community center as dusk painted the sky in lavender and rose. Harlan spoke of decades on search teams, of the ones they found and the ones they didn't. You learn to carry both, he said. The joy and the weight. They balance each other if you let them. Theron listened, not as a survivor but as a student. And in that moment he realized his purpose wasn't just to survive, but to help others carry their own weight with grace. Back in Bellingham he began writing. Not for publication at first but as a way to process. Pages filled with observations. How frost forms on pine needles at 32 degrees, how silence in deep snow isn't empty but full of listening, how hope doesn't always roar, it often whispers in the space between heartbeats. Eventually, at Leora's urging, he submitted a short essay to a nature magazine. Was accepted. Then another. Soon, editors were reaching out, asking if he'd consider a book. He hesitated. I'm not a writer, he told Leora over tea one rainy afternoon. You're a witness, she replied. And the world needs witnesses who tell the truth without flinching. So he began. Not with drama but with detail. With respect. The working title? Still Here. Not as a boast but as a quiet affirmation. Something anyone lost in any kind of wilderness might whisper to themselves in the dark. As summer deepened, Theron received an unexpected invitation from the National Park Service. They wanted him to help design a new backcountry safety module for their visitor centers. One that centered not on fear but on preparedness, community, and the simple, radical act of telling someone where you're going. He accepted immediately. The project took him to Yosemite, to Acadia, to Great Smoky Mountains National Park. In each place he walked the trails not as a tourist but as a listener. He spoke with rangers, with hikers, with families who'd lost loved ones. He collected stories like seeds, tucking them into his notebook with care. In Tennessee, a young woman told him how her brother had vanished on a solo hike and was found 3 days later, disoriented but alive, because he'd carved arrows into the dirt pointing to his location. In Maine, an elderly couple shared how they now always carry a whistle, not for emergencies but just to hear each other's signal in the fog. These stories became part of his work, woven into brochures, audio guides, and ranger training scripts. Safety isn't about control, he wrote in one draft. It's about connection. The trail doesn't care if you're strong, but people do. By autumn, Still Here was nearing completion. Theron spent long hours in his apartment, the windows open to the cool air, the scent of damp earth drifting in from the garden below. He typed slowly, deliberately, as if each word had to earn its place. He wrote about the 11 days in the ravine, yes, but more about the moments after. The warmth of a rescuer's hand on his shoulder, the taste of broth in the helicopter, the sound of his sister's voice on the hospital phone, cracking with relief. He also wrote about what came next, the slow return to trust, to movement, to belief in tomorrow. Survival doesn't end when you're found, he noted in one chapter. It begins again, quieter, deeper. You don't go back to who you were. You become someone who knows how fragile light can be, and how fiercely it must be tended. In October, exactly 1 year after his disappearance, Theron returned to Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest. This time he wasn't alone. He was accompanied by a small group, Leora, Harlan Briggs, 2 rangers from the original search team, and Mara Ellery, who'd flown in from Montana. They hiked to a meadow just below the ridge where Theron had fallen. a place now marked with a discreet bronze plaque that read, "For those who wait and those who search. For the ones still out there. Keep looking." They didn't speak much. They built a small fire, shared trail mix and thermoses of cider, and watched the sun set behind the peaks. As stars emerged, one by one, Theron stood and walked a short distance away, not far, just enough to be alone with the night. He looked up at the sky, vast and ancient, and whispered, not a prayer but a promise, "I'll keep telling the story, so no one feels truly alone out here." Back in Bellingham, life continued. Theron still mapped trails, though now he often included notes like, "Good water source at mile 3, or watch for loose scree after rain." He still hiked, always with a partner, always with a plan. And every Sunday evening, without fail, he called Leora. One crisp November morning, as frost glittered on the rooftops and the first snow of the season dusted the distant peaks, Theron received an email. It was from a high school teacher in Oregon. Her students had read an excerpt from his upcoming book, and one boy, a quiet kid who rarely spoke in class, had written a poem inspired by Theron's story. The teacher included it in the message. The poem was simple, just 12 lines. It spoke of cold, of silence, of a single spark in the dark. But the last line stayed with Theron all day. He didn't wait for the light. He became it. That afternoon, Theron sat at his desk, the poem printed and pinned to the corkboard above his maps. He opened a fresh page in his notebook and began writing. Not for a book, not for a brochure, but for that boy and for every person who's ever felt lost. "If you're reading this," he wrote, "and the world feels too big, too quiet, too heavy, know this: someone is looking for you. Maybe not right now. Maybe not in the way you expect. But they are. And until they find you, be your own rescuer. Light your own fire. Leave your own trail. You are worth the search." As evening fell, he closed the notebook, turned off his lamp, and stepped outside. The air was sharp with cold, clean and alive. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed through the valley, a sound both lonely and full of direction. Theron stood there, breathing, present, still here. And in that moment he knew, the story wasn't over. It never really is. It just passes from one set of hands to another, one heart to the next, carried forward by those who choose to believe that even in the deepest wilderness, no one is beyond reach. Winter returned to the Pacific Northwest with a gentler hush than the year before. Snow fell in slow, silent layers over Bellingham, muffling the streets and frosting the rooftops like powdered sugar. Theron watched it from his kitchen window, steam curling from a mug of chamomile tea, his notebook open on the counter beside a half-finished paragraph. He had grown accustomed to writing in the quiet hours, before dawn or just after dusk, when the world felt suspended between breaths. Still Here had been published in early December. It wasn't a bestseller in the flashy sense, but it found its people. Letters arrived weekly, sometimes daily, from hikers, teachers, search volunteers, even a retired firefighter in Alaska who said he read a chapter aloud to his crew before every shift. One envelope, postmarked from a small town in Vermont, contained only a pressed maple leaf and a note. "You helped me tell my son it's okay to be scared as long as you don't stop moving." Theron kept every letter. Not in a drawer, but pinned to a long corkboard in his study, arranged not by date, but by feeling, gratitude, grief, hope, questions. He answered each one, even if only with a few lines. "Thank you for trusting me with your story," he'd write. "Keep walking. Keep reaching." In January, he received an invitation from the U.S. Forest Service to join a national advisory panel on wilderness safety education. The meetings were held virtually, but the work was real: revising trailhead signage, developing audio alerts for changing weather, creating a standardized check-in protocol for solo hikers using a free mobile app. Theron advocated for simplicity. "Don't overwhelm people with warnings," he urged during one session. "Give them one clear action. Tell someone. Carry a beacon. Turn back if it feels wrong. Clarity saves lives." His voice, once hesitant in crowds, now carried a calm authority, born not of ego, but of experience paid for in frost and silence. He never said, "I survived," as if it made him special. He said, "I was found," as if to honor the chain of care that stretched from his ravine to the hospital bed. February brought a surprise visitor. Juno's former handler, Harlan Briggs, now retired but as sharp-eyed as ever. He arrived with a wooden box carved with paw prints. Inside was Juno's old service tag, polished smooth by time and touch. "Thought you might want to keep it," Harlan said, setting it on Theron's desk without ceremony. "She'd have liked knowing it's with you." Theron held the tag in his palm, cool and weighty. He didn't speak for a long moment. Then he walked to the bookshelf, pulled out the first edition of Still Here, and tucked the tag inside the front cover. "So she's part of the story too," he said. Harlan nodded. "Always was." That same month, Theron began teaching a monthly workshop at the local outdoor co-op. Not on survival tactics, but on listening to the land. He taught hikers how to read wind patterns in tree branches, how to spot animal trails that might lead to water, how to notice when the light shifts in a way that signals incoming weather. "The wilderness isn't hostile," he told a group of wide-eyed teenagers one Saturday morning. "It's indifferent. And that's why we must be attentive, not afraid but awake." One participant, a young woman named Elise who used a wheelchair, asked how these lessons applied to her. Theron didn't hesitate. "Awareness isn't about legs," he said. "It's about presence. You notice things others miss, the angle of a bird's flight, the smell of damp soil before rain. That's your compass. And your voice matters in this community too." Elise later started a local group called Trails for All, advocating for accessible paths and inclusive safety training. Theron became their first volunteer advisor. By spring, the snow had melted from the lower valleys, revealing mud, moss, and the first green shoots of skunk cabbage. Theron returned to mapping but with a new focus, identifying safe zones along popular backcountry routes, places with natural shelter, clean water, and clear sight lines for signaling. He submitted the data to park services across 3 states. Some adopted it immediately. Others promised to review. To Theron, even a promise was a step. In April, he traveled to Portland, not for a talk but for a quieter reason. Leora was getting married. Her fiancé, a botanist who studied alpine wildflowers, had proposed on a trail near Mount Hood. Theron walked her down the aisle, his steps steady, his hand warm on her arm. During the reception, under strings of fairy lights and the scent of blooming lilacs, she whispered, "You used to vanish into the woods. Now you help people find their way back. I'm proud of you, brother." He smiled, eyes glistening. "I'm proud we found each other again." Summer brought heat waves to the west, but the Cascades remained cool in the high country. Theron joined a ranger-led youth expedition, guiding a group of high schoolers on a 5-day trek through the North Cascades. He didn't lead from the front. He walked in the middle, watching, listening. When one boy twisted his ankle crossing a stream, Theron knelt, not with urgency but with calm. He wrapped the injury with a bandana, adjusted the boy's pack and said, "We'll go slower. The mountain isn't going anywhere." That night, around the campfire, the kids asked him what he feared most during those 11 days. "Not dying," he admitted, "but being forgotten. That no one would know I tried." A girl with braids and hiking boots asked, "Do you still go out alone?" "Never," he said. "Not because I'm afraid, but because I've learned that joy is better shared, and so is survival." Back home, he began work on a second book, this one focused not on his own story, but on the unseen heroes of the wild. Rangers, canine handlers, volunteer pilots, dispatchers who stay on the line for hours whispering reassurance to lost hikers. He called it, The Ones Who Come Looking. Early chapters featured Harlan, Mara, Dale the landlord, even the nurse who held his hand during his first fevered night in the hospital. Research took him across the country again, this time not as a speaker but as a listener. In Colorado, he spent a week with a mountain rescue team that trained on avalanche response. In Arizona, he interviewed a Navajo tracker who'd helped locate missing hikers using traditional land knowledge passed down for generations. "The land speaks," the elder told him. "You just have to know its language." Theron wrote those words down and underlined them twice. Autumn of 2025 arrived with golden light and crisp air. Theron turned 34. Leora sent him a handmade map of their childhood neighborhood in Portland, marked with all their old hiding spots. Harlan mailed a jar of huckleberry jam from his garden. And Mara, now a close friend, sent a photo of Glacier National Park at dawn with a note. The trails are waiting. No rush. On his birthday morning, Theron hiked to Fragrance Lake, a short, gentle loop near his home. He carried no pack, just a water bottle and the bronze tag from Juno, now worn smooth in his pocket. At the lake's edge, he sat on a sun-warmed rock and watched dragonflies skim the surface. The water was still, reflecting sky and trees like a second world. He thought of all the people who had walked beside him, literally and in spirit, since that cold November morning 2 years ago. He thought of the letters, the students, the quiet moments of connection that had stitched his life back together, stronger at the seams. And he thought of those still out there, somewhere in the vast, beautiful, unforgiving wild, waiting to be found. As he stood to leave, a pair of eagles circled high above, riding the thermals with effortless grace. Theron watched them until they disappeared into the blue. Then he turned toward home, boots crunching on dry pine needles, heart full but quiet. Because the truth was, he wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living, with purpose, with gratitude, with the steady knowledge that every step forward is a kind of rescue. And somewhere, in another forest, on another trail, someone else was taking their own first step back toward the light. As the last amber leaves fell from the big leaf maples in late October of 2025, Theron Vale found himself standing once more at the trailhead of Thunder Creek Basin, not as a returning survivor but as a guide for something new. The Forest Service had approved a pilot program he'd helped design, the Companion Protocol, a voluntary check-in system where hikers could register their intended route and expected return time via a simple text-based platform. If they didn't confirm their safe return within a grace period, a local ranger would initiate a welfare check. No panic, no helicopters, just a calm human response. Theron had insisted the program be named not for rescue, but for companionship. "We're not tracking people," he told the committee. "We're reminding them they're not alone." On this particular morning, crisp and still, with frost glittering on the ferns and the scent of damp cedar in the air, he wasn't alone. Beside him stood Elise, now leading a small team from Trails for All, testing an adaptive trail assessment tool she'd co-developed. A lightweight, all-terrain wheelchair equipped with GPS and emergency signaling. Behind them, a group of 10 volunteers, rangers, students, retired searchers, gathered with clipboards and tablets, ready to document terrain accessibility, signal strength, and potential shelter sites along the first 3 miles of the route. Theron adjusted his pack, feeling the familiar weight of water, first aid supplies, and Juno's tag tucked in the inner pocket. He looked at the group, not with the gravity of a leader, but with the warmth of someone who knew what it meant to be seen. "Today isn't about perfection," he said, his voice carrying easily in the quiet air. "It's about presence. Notice the small things, the way the light hits a rock, the sound underfoot, the space between breaths. That's where safety lives. Not in gear, but in attention." They set off slowly, deliberately. Elise's chair rolled smoothly over the newly reinforced boardwalks, her team noting gradients and surface stability. Theron walked beside her, pointing out subtle trail markers he'd helped install, small, unobtrusive discs embedded in trees, visible only to those who knew to look. Each bore a QR code linking to real-time weather updates and emergency contacts. Halfway to the basin, they paused at a bend where the creek widened into a shallow pool. It was here 2 years prior that Theron had melted snow in his dented canteen, hands shaking, breath fogging the air like a ghost. Now, sunlight danced on the water, and a dipper bird bobbed along the rocks, unbothered by their presence. Elise turned to him. "Does it ever feel strange? Coming back?" Theron looked at the water, then at the faces around him, alive, curious, engaged. "Not strange," he said. "Sacred. This place didn't take from me. It asked me to remember who I was. And now we're helping others do the same, without having to pay the same price." Later that afternoon, as the group regrouped near the old lean-to site, now marked not with caution tape, but with a small interpretive plaque, Theron received a text. It was from Mara Ellery. "Heard you're out there testing the Companion Protocol. Proud of you." Also, Juno's tag would be smiling. He smiled, tucking the phone away. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. One of the student volunteers, a young man named Kieran who'd lost his uncle in a hiking accident years ago, approached quietly. "Do you think, if something like this had existed back then?" His voice trailed off. Theron met his eyes. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I do know this. Grief doesn't have to be the end of the story. Sometimes, it becomes the reason we build something better. Your uncle's memory is part of why we're here today. That matters." Kieran nodded, wiping his cheek with the back of his glove. "I signed up to be a trail monitor next season. Just to be part of the looking." "That's enough," Theron said. "More than enough." By dusk, the team returned to the trailhead, tired but energized. Data had been logged, photos uploaded, feedback shared. The companion protocol had passed its first real-world test. As the others loaded gear into vehicles, Theron lingered, watching the last light gild the western ridge. He thought of all the unseen threads that had brought him here. The fall, the snow, the faint beep of a dying beacon, the hands that pulled him from the cold. And then the hands that held him afterward. The nurses, the rangers, his sister's tear-streaked face, Harlan's steady gaze, Elisa's unwavering belief that the wild should welcome everyone. He wasn't just a man who'd been lost and found. He was a node in a vast, quiet network of care, a living bridge between solitude and community. Back in Bellingham that night, he sat at his desk, the city quiet beyond his window. He opened a new document, not for a book this time, but for a letter. It was addressed to no one and everyone, to the next person who steps onto a trail with a full heart and an empty plan, to the dispatcher who answers a faint call in the dark, to the dog who barks at a glove buried in snow. "Dear friend," he began, "if you're reading this, you're already part of the story. You don't need to be fearless. You just need to be willing, to prepare, to listen, to tell someone where you're going. And if you ever find yourself in the silence, remember, someone is coming. They always are." He saved the file as for the one still walking. The next morning, before sunrise, he received an alert from the companion protocol dashboard. A hiker on the Mount Si trail had failed to check in. Theron didn't panic. He called the local ranger station, shared the coordinates, and offered to meet them at the trailhead. Within an hour, they located the hiker, a woman who'd twisted her knee near the summit. She was cold, shaken, but safe. When she saw Theron approaching with a thermal blanket and a calm smile, she whispered, "I saw your book in the trailhead kiosk. I kept thinking, if he made it, maybe I can too." He helped her to the stretcher, then walked beside the rescue team all the way down. At the parking lot, she gripped his hand. "Thank you for making sure someone was looking." "No," he said gently. "Thank you for letting us find you." In the weeks that followed, the companion protocol expanded to 5 more national forests. Schools began incorporating its principles into outdoor education. A documentary crew reached out, interested in telling the broader story, not just of survival but of the systems of care that rise when communities choose to look out for one another. Theron agreed to participate, but only if the focus remained on the collective, not the individual. "This isn't my story," he told the producer. "It's ours." As November approached, the same month he'd vanished 2 years before, he organized a quiet gathering at Fragrance Lake. No speeches, no cameras. Just a circle of people who'd been part of the journey. Leora and her husband, Harlan, Elise, Mara, who flew in just for the day, Dale the landlord, Kieran, and a handful of rangers and volunteers. They shared food, stories, and silence. At sunset, they each placed a smooth stone on a small cairn they'd built together, a symbol not of an ending but of continuity. Theron placed his last. As he stepped back, he felt not closure but connection, deep, enduring, alive. That night, alone in his apartment, he opened his notebook to a fresh page. He didn't write about fear or survival. He wrote about light, how it filters through forest canopies, how it glints off creek water, how it lives in the eyes of someone who's been found. And then he wrote one final line, not for publication, but for himself. "I am still here. And so, I will keep looking." The winter of 2026 arrived not with the fury of past seasons, but with a hushed reverence, as if the land itself was pausing to honor all that had grown from silence. Snow fell in soft veils over the cascades, dusting the pines and filling the ravines with stillness. In Bellingham, Theron watched the first flakes from his window, a steaming mug in hand, his breath fogging the glass just slightly. He no longer saw winter as a threat. He saw it as a teacher, one that demanded respect, patience, and above all, preparation. By now, the companion protocol had been adopted in 17 national forests across the country. What began as a local pilot had evolved into a quiet national movement, not driven by headlines but by word of mouth, ranger recommendations, and the simple, powerful truth that people want to come home and be welcomed when they do. Theron still advised the development team, though he'd stepped back from day-to-day operations. His role now was more philosophical, ensuring the system never lost its humanity beneath layers of technology. Algorithms can track location, he told a tech partner during a virtual meeting, but only people can carry hope. That same month, The Ones Who Come Looking was released to quiet acclaim. Unlike his first book, this one carried no photographs of Theron, no dramatic reenactments. Instead, it opened with a dedication to every voice that said, "Keep talking, we hear you in the dark." Chapters unfolded like campfire stories, Harlan and Juno tracking scent through snow, Mara navigating a whiteout with nothing but a compass and memory, a teenage dispatcher in Colorado who stayed on the line with a lost hiker for 6 hours, singing folk songs to keep him awake. Readers wrote to say they'd never considered the people behind the rescue, the ones who drive through the night, who train dogs to read the wind, who answer emergency calls with calm voices while their own hearts race. One letter came from a retired schoolteacher in Maine who'd started a trail buddy program at her local senior center. "We don't hike far," she wrote, "but we always go together. And we always tell someone." Theron pinned that letter at the very center of his corkboard. In January, he received an unexpected call from the Department of the Interior. They wanted to nominate him for the National Public Service Award, a rare honor for a civilian. He declined at first. "I didn't do anything extraordinary," he told the official. "I just listened." But Leora convinced him otherwise. "You turned pain into a path for others," she said over video call, her newborn daughter sleeping in her arms. "Let them honor that. Not you, the idea." So he accepted, not for himself, but as a representative of all the unseen hands that hold the line between lost and found. The ceremony was held in Washington, D.C., in a sunlit hall filled with people who'd spent lifetimes serving quietly. Theron wore a simple wool coat, no tie, and carried Juno's tag in his pocket like a talisman. When his name was called, he walked to the podium not with pride, but with humility. "I stand here," he began, "not because I survived the wilderness, but because others refused to let me disappear into it. This award belongs to every ranger who walked one more mile, every volunteer who checked one more ravine, every family member who kept calling even when no one answered. They are the true compass." Afterward, a young intern approached him, eyes bright. "I'm studying emergency management. Your work? It made me believe this field isn't just about logistics. It's about love." Theron smiled. "It's about showing up, even when you're tired, even when the odds are thin. Especially then." Back in Washington State, life resumed its gentle rhythm. Theron resumed his weekly mapping sessions, now collaborating with indigenous land stewards to integrate traditional ecological knowledge into trail safety guides. He learned about fire readiness from elders of the Lummi Nation, about water sources from Yakama trackers, about seasonal shifts from Nez Perce storytellers. "The land has memory," one elder told him. "We're just learning to listen again." He began including these insights in his public talks, not as add-ons but as foundations. "Western safety protocols save lives," he'd say, "but ancestral wisdom teaches us how to belong to the land without conquering it. Both are necessary." In March, Elise launched the first fully accessible backcountry loop in the Mount Baker foothills, a half-mile trail with gentle slopes, tactile markers for the visually impaired, and emergency call stations every 200 yards. Theron was there for the ribbon cutting, standing beside her as she wheeled across the threshold. Cameras flashed, but what mattered most was the quiet cheer from families who'd never thought they'd see their loved ones experience the wild up close. Later, as they sat by a fire pit overlooking the trail, Elise turned to him. You know, I used to think the wilderness wasn't for people like me. Now I see, it was never the land that excluded us. It was the systems. And systems, Theron said, can be rebuilt. Spring brought wildflowers and longer days. Theron took fewer trips now, preferring to deepen roots rather than stretch branches. He mentored 2 young cartographers, both women of color who'd grown up believing the outdoors wasn't their space. He taught them not just how to read contours, but how to read silence, how to honor uncertainty, how to map with empathy. One evening, while reviewing a draft of a new trail guide, he received a message from Kieran. The young man had completed his wilderness first responder certification and was now leading weekend safety workshops for high schoolers. I tell them your story, he wrote. Not the part about the snow. The part about telling someone. Theron replied simply, then you're already a rescuer. As summer approached, Theron began work on a new project. One quieter than books or protocols, but perhaps more enduring. He partnered with a local library to create a trail library, a free lending system where hikers could borrow emergency kits, beacons, whistles, fire starters, even satellite messengers, alongside guidebooks and laminated safety checklists. No fees. No questions. Just trust. The idea spread. Within months, libraries from Oregon to Vermont had replicated it. One librarian in Vermont wrote, "We've lent out over 200 kits this year. 3 times borrowers activated beacons. All were found within hours. You've turned libraries into lifelines." He kept that note beside his bed. In late July, Theron returned to Thunder Creek, not for data, not for ceremony, but for solitude. He hiked alone but not recklessly. He'd filed a digital check-in, carried 2 beacons, and told Leora his route. The trail was familiar now, yet never the same. Sunlight shifted. Trees grew. Creeks changed course. He sat by the same pool where he'd once melted snow, and this time he dipped his hand in the cold water and smiled. He wasn't the same man who'd fallen here. And that was okay. On the hike back, he spotted fresh bear tracks near a berry patch. He paused, gave space, and whispered a quiet thanks, for the warning, for the wildness, for the chance to witness life continuing undisturbed. By autumn, the Trail Library Initiative had been awarded a federal grant, ensuring its expansion into rural and underserved communities. Theron used part of the funding to create audio guides in multiple languages, including Spanish, Vietnamese, and Navajo, so that safety information could reach those often left out of mainstream outdoor culture. He also began recording short voice notes, calm, clear messages about weather shifts, trail conditions, and mental preparedness that hikers could download before heading out. "Your mind is your first shelter," one recording said. "Tend to it like a fire." October returned, crisp and golden. On the 3rd anniversary of his rescue, Theron didn't hold a gathering. Instead, he drove to a small cemetery outside Bellingham, where Juno was buried beneath a maple tree. He placed a single pine cone on her marker and sat quietly for a long time. "You were the first to find me," he said softly, "even before they knew I was gone." As he stood to leave, a park ranger he recognized from the original search walked by, walking a young German Shepherd pup. "This is Juno too," the ranger said with a smile. "In training. She's got the same nose." Theron knelt, letting the pup sniff his hand. Her eyes were bright, curious, full of purpose. He felt something loosen in his chest, not grief but continuity. Back home that night, he opened his notebook one last time. He didn't write about survival. He wrote about belonging, how the wild doesn't demand perfection, only presence, how being found begins with believing you're worth finding, how every act of care, however small, ripples outward like a stone dropped in still water. And then he closed the book, not because the story was over, but because it was being lived. By him, by Elise, by Kieran, by Mara, by Harlan, by every hiker who tells someone where they're going, by every ranger who walks one more mile. The next morning, before dawn, his phone chimed, a companion protocol alert. A solo hiker on the Olympic Peninsula hadn't checked in. Theron didn't hesitate. He grabbed his pack, sent a quick text to the local ranger station, and stepped out into the cool, starlit air. Because the work wasn't done. It never would be. And that was the point. The Olympic Peninsula in early November was a world wrapped in mist and moss, where ancient cedars dripped with rain and the air smelled of salt, soil, and thyme. Theron drove south from Bellingham with the windows cracked, the steady hum of tires on wet pavement a familiar rhythm. He wasn't leading the response. Local rangers had that covered, but he'd been asked to consult on terrain navigation, given his experience with microshelter identification in dense, wet forests. More than that, he went because he knew what it felt like to wait in the cold, hoping someone would understand the land well enough to find you. The missing hiker was a woman named Cora Lynn, 58, a botanist from Seattle who'd gone to study rare lichens in the Hoh rainforest. She'd filed a companion protocol check-in, listing her intended route and a return window. When she missed her check by 4 hours, the system triggered an amber alert. By the time Theron arrived at the ranger station near Forks, a ground team was already mobilizing. He met Ranger Diaz, a woman with sharp eyes and mud-splattered boots, who handed him a topographic map marked with Cora's last known GPS ping. "She's off trail," Diaz said. "But not far. Probably slipped near the Quinault tributary. We've got drones up, but this canopy, it's like trying to see through a blanket." Theron studied the map, then looked up at the wall of green beyond the station. "She's a botanist," he said. "She wouldn't wander randomly. She'd follow ecological indicators, water, light gaps, nurse logs. If she's injured, she'd look for natural shelter that also offers visibility. Not deep in the brush. Near an edge." Diaz nodded. "That narrows it." Within the hour, Theron was in the field with a 2-person team, moving slowly through the saturated undergrowth. Rain fell in a soft drizzle, soaking their jackets but not their resolve. Theron scanned not just for footprints, but for disturbance. The bend of a fern, the scuff on a mossy log, the unnatural stillness of a bird that had flown off moments before. After 90 minutes, they found it. A small depression beneath a fallen cedar, reinforced with fern fronds and a tarp pulled from a day pack. Inside, wrapped in a silver emergency blanket, sat Cora, cold, dehydrated, but conscious. She twisted her ankle crossing a slick log and, unable to hike out, had built a shelter using techniques she'd read about in Theron's first book. When she saw him, her eyes widened. "You're Theron Vale." He knelt, keeping his voice low and calm. "I am. And you did everything right. You stayed put. You conserved heat. You made yourself visible." He gestured to the bright orange bandana tied to a branch above her, a signal she'd improvised from her rain shell lining. Cora managed a weak smile. "I remembered what you wrote. Hope isn't passive. It's what you build while you wait." As the medics arrived and carefully lifted her onto a stretcher, she reached for Theron's hand. "Tell me something," she whispered. "Was it worth it? Going back out there?" He didn't hesitate. Every step. Later, back at the station, Diaz handed him a cup of strong coffee. "You've got a gift," she said. "Not just for reading the land. For making people believe they can survive it." "It's not a gift," Theron replied. "It's responsibility. Once you've been lost, you owe it to others to help them feel found, even before they're missing." That night, instead of driving home, he stayed in a cabin near Lake Crescent. Rain tapped gently on the roof as he sat by the wood stove, writing in his notebook by lamplight. He didn't write about Cora's rescue. He wrote about the moment she tied that orange bandana, a small act of defiance against despair. That, he realized, was the heart of it all. Not grand heroics, but the quiet decision to keep trying. In the weeks that followed, Cora recovered fully. She reached out to Theron, not with thanks, but with an invitation. She was compiling a field guide on symbiotic relationships in Pacific Northwest forests. How fungi feed trees, how birds disperse seeds, how fallen logs become nurseries for new life. "Everything here is connected," she wrote. "Just like people. I'd be honored if you'd write the foreword." He accepted. In it, he wrote, "Survival is never solitary. It is woven from threads of preparation, community, and the stubborn belief that someone is listening. The forest knows this. Now so do we." By December, the trail library had expanded to 42 locations nationwide. Theron worked with librarians to develop wilderness literacy workshops, teaching children how to read maps, identify safe water sources, and understand that nature isn't a backdrop, but a living system they belong to. In one rural town in New Mexico, a group of students used what they'd learned to help locate a lost grandfather who'd wandered from his property. The local paper called it the Library Rescue. Theron kept the clipping. The new year brought unexpected news. The companion protocol was being integrated into the national 911 emergency infrastructure as a supplementary layer for wilderness incidents. No longer just a voluntary app, it would soon be accessible through any mobile carrier, with automatic location sharing if a distress keyword was texted. Theron was invited to testify before a Senate subcommittee on public safety. He prepared carefully, not with statistics but with stories. He spoke of Cora, of Elise, of the teenager in Colorado who sang to stay awake, of Juno's unwavering nose in the snow. Technology doesn't save lives, he concluded. People do. But good design can give people the chance to act in time. His testimony was widely praised, not for its polish but for its humanity. In February, Harlan Briggs turned 80. Theron drove to his cabin in the Methow Valley for the celebration. There were no balloons, just a wood-fired stove, a pot of stew, and Juno too curled at Harlan's feet. Over dinner, Harlan handed Theron a small wooden box. Inside was a hand-carved compass, its needle steady, its face engraved with two words, "Still here." "I made it last winter," Harlan said. "Thought you might need a reminder that direction isn't just about north. It's about purpose." Theron held it like something sacred. Spring returned with cherry blossoms and longer light. Theron began spending more time in his garden, planting native species that supported pollinators. Another form of tending, another kind of rescue. He still hiked, but always with a partner, always with intention. He'd taken to carrying a small journal where he recorded not just trail conditions, but moments of beauty. The flash of a kingfisher over a creek, the way fog lifted like a curtain at dawn, the laughter of kids on a school hike he'd guided. One afternoon in May, while walking with Leora and her daughter, now a curious toddler with mud on her boots and wildflowers in her hair, Theron realized something. He wasn't just teaching survival anymore. He was teaching belonging. "Why do we come here, Uncle Theron?" the little girl asked, pointing to the mountains. "Because the earth holds us," he said, lifting her onto his shoulders. "And we learn to hold it back." By summer, the ones who come looking had been adapted into a curriculum for wilderness first responder courses across the country. Trainees didn't just learn medical skills, they studied empathy, communication, and the psychology of being lost. Theron recorded voice modules used in simulations. Calm, steady prompts designed to ground both rescuer and rescued. In July, he received a letter from a prison rehabilitation program in Oregon. Inmates were using his books in a wilderness therapy initiative, learning navigation and teamwork as part of their reintegration process. One man wrote, "You taught me that being lost doesn't mean you're gone. That changed everything." Theron wrote back to each of them. Autumn of 2027 arrived with golden light and a sense of quiet fullness. Theron turned 35. He celebrated not with fanfare, but with a solo hike to Fragrance Lake. This time with full permission from his sister, a detailed itinerary and 2 check-in reminders set on his phone. At the lake's edge, he sat on his favorite rock and opened his notebook one last time. He didn't write a new chapter. He wrote a letter to his younger self, the one shivering in the snow, wondering if anyone would come. "You were worth the search," he wrote. "And so is everyone after you." As the sun dipped below the trees, painting the water in rose and amber, Theron stood, brushed pine needles from his coat, and began the walk home. The trail was familiar but never taken for granted. Every step was a promise, to the land, to the people, to the quiet truth that no one walks alone if we choose to look. And somewhere, in another forest, another person was tying an orange bandana to a branch, whispering into the wind, "I'm still here." But on that same autumn evening, as Theron walked back from Fragrance Lake with the golden light fading behind the firs, something shifted in the air, so subtly that even his attuned senses didn't catch it at first. The birds had gone quiet. Not the usual hush of dusk, but an absence, as if the forest itself had drawn a breath and held it. He paused, glancing over his shoulder. The trail behind him was empty, just the familiar curve of packed earth and fallen leaves. Yet the hairs on his neck rose. He checked his phone. No signal, though he'd had full bars moments before. The compass in his pocket, Harlan's gift, spun lazily, then settled, pointing west. Not north. West, toward the old ravine where he'd once lain half frozen, waiting for a sound that never came. He told himself it was the cold, the wind, the weight of memory. But when he reached his car, the driver's side door was unlocked. He was certain he'd locked it. Inside nothing was missing. Nothing was moved. Except for one thing. Tucked beneath the windshield wiper on the passenger side, a single frost-covered pine cone. The kind that only grew high on the northern slopes of Thunder Creek Basin. The kind he'd placed on Juno's grave just weeks ago. His breath caught. No one else knew about that pine cone. No one had been with him. He scanned the trees. Nothing. Only shadows lengthening, merging with the coming dark. Then, as he started the engine, his phone buzzed. An alert from the companion protocol system. Not an emergency. A test notification. But the message read, check-in confirmed. User, Theron Vale. Location, Thunder Creek Ravine. Status, still here. His blood turned to ice. He hadn't triggered any check-in today. He hadn't been near Thunder Creek. And the system didn't use that phrase, still here. That was his words. His book title. His private mantra. He looked again at the pine cone on the windshield. Now, in the dimming light, he saw it wasn't frost that coated it. It was fine, crystalline ice, forming in real time despite the 50-degree air. The engine idled. The forest watched. And deep in his pocket, Harlan's compass needle trembled, then pointed straight down into the earth. Theron didn't drive away immediately. He sat there, hands gripping the wheel, heart hammering not with fear of the wild, but with the chilling certainty that something out there knew his name, knew his story, and was now writing the next line. Because sometimes the thing that finds you in the wilderness isn't trying to bring you home. It's making sure you never leave.